All right. Yeah, we just read First Corinthians chapter 11. So my talk this morning is going to be based on that. I've heard a few good studies recently, and I kind of looked at those studies and some reading of my own to come up with this and to kind of look into this a little bit more deeply about what we do when we come to the bread and the wine. So why are we here? Now, I was baptized in 1997, long time ago. 97. I've got it written down somewhere. So a long time. So I've taken bread and wine hundreds of times, so many times. You come here every week and you break bread. And a lot of times, I remember in the past, I didn't really know what I was doing and why I was taking it. Um, the ecclesias that I was at, it was a very solemn occasion. So we were all dressed nicely. It was very quiet. The children used to be put to the side somewhere so we couldn't hear those pesky little kids. And it was a very solemn and quiet occasion. And that's not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but that was kind of my understanding of it. And my mind sort of followed that track. And I thought, well, we have to be quiet when we come here and be reverent and things like that. So yeah, it was an interesting kind of recollection that I had and a memory I had of the bread and wine. So we used to sit there, think about how we had been doing the wrong thing and kind of feel sorry for it. But is that really what it's all about? So why do we actually come to a memorial service? Should we come here just to feel how bad we are? Remind ourselves week by week how much we failed, to stare at the bread and wine and think, I don't deserve this. But if all this focus is only inward on my guilt, my failings, my private thoughts, actually it'd be easier for me to do this at home. I'd do it in my own room. I could do it much better. I'd have no distraction here at all. So if it's only introspective, why do we come here together? And in fact, that's what a lot of people learned during COVID. We couldn't meet together. A lot of people couldn't meet together. Many admitted later and they said, I got more out of the memorial service when I was at home because it was quieter and I didn't have any distractions. So we should stop and think, why did that make us feel better? Maybe we've misunderstood the purpose of the memorial service altogether. Because if it's only about introspection and feeling guilty, then yes, home is definitely better. But maybe that's not what God had in mind at all. So if it's not meant to be a private, quiet moment of guilt and self-judgment, what is it? It should be a public gathering of remembrance, a communal celebration of what God's done and a shared encouragement to carry on. So that's where I want to start this morning. Time over time, I've come to believe that we had it wrong, and many of us still do. So we've misunderstood the purpose of the memorial service. It's not about private guilt, but it's about public remembrance and communal encouragement. It's about showing up for each other. It's about being present, mind, body, and spirit. Not just to remember Jesus intellectually and theory, but embody his example in how we treat the people around us. So my history, and because of that, I used to think that reverence meant silence. And we always say we have to come before God in reverence. Yes, we do. But I connected reverence with silence. So being spiritual meant keeping to myself, thinking quietly about how sinful I was. But the more I looked into it, and the more I looked at Jesus' example of the Last Supper, the more I saw something completely different. In fact, I saw someone in his darkest hour who wasn't focused on himself at all. He was focused on his 12 disciples, 11 by the end of it. He got down and he washed their feet. He encouraged them. He warned them. He prayed. He did all those things, and then he said, do this in remembrance of me. What was he doing? He was serving his disciples. So it's not just thinking about me and feeling guilty about what I did or didn't do. It's about, what did I do? Did I serve? Did I encourage? Did I speak? Did I help? So why are we here? Is it to sit and think about how bad we are? And again, I can do that better at home. But if it's to see somebody else, to ask how they're doing, to pray with them, to eat and drink with them, then this space matters. Meeting together matters. The body matters. So let's keep that question in our mind as we go in further. What did Jesus really mean when he said, do this in remembrance of me? I never really understood that, because the answer may end up changing what we see in this meeting. So Jesus' final supper, he left behind a pattern for us to follow. So he gathered all his disciples in that upper room, the exact night that he was about to be betrayed and killed, and he wasn't thinking about himself. That alone is remarkable. In Luke chapter 22 and verse 15, he says, with fervent desire, I've desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffered. So he knew what was coming. He could be very well justified in thinking, right, I've got to get away from all this. I've got to get some private prayer, and, the angels were there to help him. He could have done that. And he did do that at some part in the night. But what he did, the key part of his night, was about his brothers and sisters, about his disciples. His desire wasn't for solitude. It wasn't to escape. It wasn't to retreat into private prayer just yet. He wanted to be with them. He knew what was coming in their life, and he wanted to support them through it. He wanted to give them the very last bit of advice he could get. Most of us, when we're overwhelmed or anxious, our instinct is pull away, to isolate, to kind of deal with it on our own. But not Jesus. He gathered his friends. Now, these weren't perfect people. They weren't polished saints. These are friends who misunderstood him. They still didn't know that he was going to die. These are friends, when he really needed them, fell asleep. He asked them to stay and watch and pray, and they fell asleep on him. He knew they were going to do that. He also knew they were all going to run away just hours later when he needed them the most. And yet he still said, I really, really, really wanted to eat this meal with you. So it tells us something about what he was valuing, something about this moment, the breaking of bread, sharing of wine, what it was really meant to be. So what did he do in that room? Well, he took bread and he broke it and he said, this is my body given for you. He passed the cup and said, this is the new covenant in my blood shed for you. But he didn't stop there. So he gave them that. And then what do these disciples do, these people that he's spending the time with? Well, they started arguing about who was going to be the most important. They still didn't know what was happening. So when Jesus is giving all of this to his disciples, they're thinking themselves. They're thinking about who's going to be most important. And what did Jesus do? He didn't scold them. He stood up at the table, took a towel and washed their feet. Even Judas, who he knew was going to betray him. Very powerful. And even when Peter made his bold promises, Jesus said, I've prayed for you that your faith shouldn't fail. So when anxiety filled the room, Jesus talked about unity and love and sending the Comforter. And then he said, do this in remembrance of me. So we've always kind of thought about, what does that mean? Well, remembering me, we remember the bread and wine, we remember the sacrifice, we remember how bad we were. That's not really taking that line in context. The context was Jesus was giving of himself to these people who didn't quite understand what was happening. He was making himself a servant to them all. And the purpose of him doing that was to help them. He knew difficult times were coming for them. He knew they would all fail and run away and hide themselves. So what was he doing when he said, do this in remembrance of me? He was taking care of his disciples at great cost to himself. He could have spent this time with the angels and supporting himself in prayer, but he didn't. Do this in remembrance of me. So he was serving, encouraging, preparing, praying. So maybe remembering him isn't about thinking about what we've done wrong. It's about thinking about what he actually did. He didn't just break bread. He broke pride. And he didn't pass a cup. He passed on a mission. So he didn't remember a sacrifice, because remember, they were there for the Passover. He didn't just remember a sacrifice. He called his disciples to be one. So do this in remembrance of me isn't a command to remember his death. It's a call to remember how he lived and to live like that, especially when we're gathered together, especially when we're facing our own struggles. When we come to this table, Jesus didn't just come to that meal seeking comfort. He came to give comfort. He didn't come to talk about his pain. He came to help his disciples through their confusion and fear. And that's the pattern that he left for us. And it kind of confronts our modern tendency to turn the memorial service into a quiet, internal space for personal guilt management. It's not what Jesus had in mind. There is a place for reflection. There is a place for sorrow and self-awareness. But as Jesus' example showed, the heart of this gathering is relational, not isolated. It's communal, not personalized. It's not about retreating into our minds. It's about stepping into somebody else's life. So looking at those people who are here and how we can support them. So when he said, do this in remembrance of me, he's not saying, remember I died. He's saying, remember how I lived. And live that way, together as I've pulled you all here today. That's the pattern. That's the calling. And that's why this meeting matters, because it reminds us not of how far we've fallen short, but of how we should live. It lifts our eyes to see how far Jesus wants to include us and how far we should go to include each other. All of us will come here with a personal battle. All of us struggle with something, especially during the weeks. Just like Jesus did, he came to this memorial meeting that we're looking at now. He had more struggles than all of us. He was about to die. And yet he put his disciples well ahead of himself. So to understand what Jesus meant by do this in remembrance of me, we need to understand what he was remembering. The Last Supper didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built on the foundations of another feast, a Passover. Now that meal was steeped in meaning, memory, cultural identity. This is a very, I always say, this is a cultural reference. We hear Passover and it doesn't really evoke any emotion in us. It's a theory only. But if you talk to a Jewish person about Passover, they will have all these feelings. It would be like describing Chinese New Year to a Chinese person. You don't remember a date. You remember the family getting together, everybody eating, the discussions that go on. That's what this was all about. So this was the Passover. Now, was the Passover a solemn, introspective feast? It wasn't. It was quite the opposite. It's a little bit like Chinese New Year. It's loud. So this was a family celebration of the rescue from Exodus chapter 12. So God instituted the Passover. And he said in chapter 13, verse 8, tell your son on that day, it's because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So God is actually telling them all the way back then, during this feast, tell your son, your kids, this is what it's for. And he says the kids are going to ask you what this is for, and you're going to tell them. Now, how are you going to do that if you've got the kids in a different room because they're noisy, and you put them out because they're going to interrupt us? It doesn't work, does it? And God didn't tell the Israelites, tell your son how sinful we were, and that's why we were in Egypt. He said, tell them what I did. Tell them about the rescue that I did. There's a positive message that came out. So the kids weren't in another room, hidden away, quiet. They were front and center, asking questions, participating, belonging. So the Passover was noisy because it was a household event. There were lambs roasting, bread baking, kids asking questions, parents telling stories. It was real life, and God loved it. God wanted his people to celebrate these things, to eat, to talk, to remember they were free, not because they were good, but because God was gracious. So think about that, and then think about this in the context of Jesus. On the night he was betrayed, he chose that meal as the moment to institute our memorial service. So that tells us a little bit about this memorial that we have. So we come to 1 Corinthians 11. This is the record from Paul. This is the one he got directly from Jesus. You hear it so many times. Let a man examine himself. Whoever eats and drinks unworthily is guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Ugh. Sounds serious, ominous, heavy, frightening. And for many of us, the reason we sat down in silence and we spend the time thinking, I'm not worthy enough. I didn't pray enough. I wasn't Christ-like enough. I shouldn't be here. We do that because of that line, and we misunderstand that line. But again, we take a step back. Context is everything. What was actually happening in Corinth? So the ecclesia in Corinth is just like any other ecclesia. They had problems. All ecclesias will have them. These ones were big. They weren't just small disagreements. These were real spiritual dysfunctions. People were just dividing up into cliques and saying, I'm Paul, and one's I'm Apollos, and one's following Christ. Or even taking each other to court and suing each other in a public court. That's happening in the ecclesia of Corinth. So they're flaunting their freedom. They're eating food offered to idols. They didn't care if it caused somebody else to stumble. So by the time we read into chapter 11, they're even turning the Lord's Supper into a selfish feast. He writes there, when you come together, is it not the Lord's Supper that you eat? For in eating, everyone goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry and another gets drunk. So that's what's happening. They're not eating together. They're flaunting it. So if one person's rich, they're going to come in with their caviar and lobster and a bottle of wine, and then somebody else is poor, they're going to come in with a crust of bread, and the rich person's going to flaunt it because they're richer. That's not a good way for an ecclesia to operate, and it's not the right way for us to look at this feast together. So there was no sharing, no consideration, no discernment of the body. It had become selfish, segregated, competitive. And Paul was appalled, and he said, examine yourselves. He's not saying sit quietly and feel ashamed. He's saying examine yourself in the context of your attitude towards the body, your brothers and sisters. Examine yourself in context of what Jesus did right there. So this is a shift in understanding. So Paul isn't warning us against imperfection, because we're all imperfect. None of us are ever worthy in that sense. None of us can come to the bread and wine and sit there with a smile on our face because we haven't sinned for the week. He's warning us against indifference. So when we come to the memorial service without regard for each other, then we forget this is not about us. It's not just about me. When we don't discern the body, and by the body, Paul isn't referring to the physical body of Jesus on the cross. He's talking about the living body of Christ, the ecclesia. It says in chapter 10, verse 17, because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we all share the same one loaf. So when we talk about the body of Christ, yes, it's referenced in the bread, but the reference is for all of us here. So when we're sitting here thinking only about ourselves, of how we feel, how we failed, what we need to do, then we're not discerning the body. We've missed the whole point. So Paul's remedy is recentering on Christ and his body. So Paul's solution wasn't to shut the meeting down. He wasn't trying to say you're too sinful to participate. His message was, stop thinking about this like an individual. Start thinking about it like a collective body. He reminded them what Jesus said. He said, this is my body given for you. When you're talking about giving something to somebody, you're no longer competitive with that person. You're thinking about their needs. Do this in remembrance of me. So the context of the command isn't isolation. It's a shared experience, mutual care, humility, love. So that changes these words. They're no longer so ominous anymore. This is Paul's reminder that we're all together in this. We're all one body in Christ. So what does unworthy participation mean? So it doesn't mean showing up with no sin in your life, because none of us can do that. What it means, and we see this from the context, is showing up without any care for the community, without any love, without humility, without noticing who's missing or who's hurting or who's sitting alone. Unworthy participation isn't about failing. It's about forgetting. Forgetting that this table was never meant for individuals, but for a family. So we don't come here to consume, we come here to commune. So what does it really mean to remember Jesus? We say it every week. We read it in 1 Corinthians as we did this morning. Do this in remembrance of me. But over time, the phrase loses its weight. It becomes routine, abstract. And again, we start to connect that with quietness and reverence. Do this in remembrance of me. And when you say that to me, I'm already thinking about a quiet, reverent place, because that's just what we do every single week. So it's not really what Jesus meant. Yes, the cross mattered, the sacrifice mattered, the weight of all that deserves reverence, but it's not the whole picture. If we reduce remembrance to guilt, we actually miss the full power of what Jesus was doing in that upper room. When Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, he didn't want just his death remembered. He wanted his life imitated. And that's something that the language that Paul used in 1 Corinthians 11. So from quiet guilt to active imitation. So think about it. The Last Supper with the disciples, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't introspective. It was filled with questions, confusions, teachings, warnings. They were even arguing there. And that's what Jesus wanted, these communal acts to be done together. And it was in the middle of all of that that Jesus stood up and tied the towel around his waist and then went and washed their feet. So he didn't say, sit and reflect. I've given you an example. Now sit there and think how bad you are and how not deserving you were. No, that's not the kind of remembrance he wanted. He set a model, not just silence, but service. So when we reduce the memorial service to inward guilt, we risk making it more about our sin than Jesus' love. We stop short of the real invitation to live as he lived, from being passive to participating. I mean, it's easier to sit in silence than to engage someone in conversation. It's easier to feel guilty than get up and help somebody. It's easier to come to the memorial service to receive rather than to give. But Jesus didn't call us to an easy life. He called us to participate. He modeled this feast, this table, where everyone was welcome, where the weak were served, where love flowed freely, even to those who didn't deserve it. And there was none more than the people at that table. And he said, do this, be this, live this together. And we remember him best by not sitting quietly with our guilt, but actively embracing his way of living with humility, generosity, and grace. So remembrance is a living practice. When we break bread, we don't just remember that Jesus died, we remember how he lived. And if that's true, then the memorial table becomes more than just a place of reflection. It becomes a training ground for the kind of people that God's calling us to be. It becomes a weekly recommit, not just to believe in Christ, but to follow him, to be the one who serves, to be the one who listens, to be the one who forgives, to be the one who shows up early and stays late. That's remembrance. It's not a moment. It's not silence. It's a call to action. So the next time we hear the words, do this in remembrance of me, let's hear it as a challenge, not a comfort. Let's ask, what should I feel right now? But instead, what should I be doing because of this? Because remembering Jesus should make us move. So where does this leave us? So we've looked at Jesus' example. We've looked at the Old Testament feast. We've looked at Paul's correction to the Corinthians. But the question is, what do we do with it now? How do we live this out every week in our own ecclesia? Because if we accept that the memorial meeting isn't just about remembering a death, but embodying a life, then something will change. It can't stay the same. It's not just about what we believe, it's about how we behave when we gather. And it starts with engagement. If the memorial service is meant to reflect Christ's love and selflessness, then the most Christ-like thing we can do on a Sunday morning is to be here and to talk to someone. We look around the room, we notice who's here, who's not here, who needs something. It's a bit easier with a small ecclesia like ours. It's a bit more difficult when you have a really, really big congregation. But that's what we need to do. And we do it the best here in Malaysia. We do it over food, which is great. So when I remember Jesus, that's what I see, the body in action. We embrace the noise. There's often an unspoken tension between reverence and reality. You want the room to be quiet, focused, holy, and yeah, there's value in that. But holiness isn't always the sound of silence. We see that from the old feasts that they were remembering. Sometimes holiness sounds like laughter. Sometimes holiness is a child asking their parent, why do we eat this bread every week? Or sometimes someone checking in with an elderly brother or sister or somebody who's not feeling well or something like that. They're not distractions to holiness, they are holiness. This is the exact moments that Christ died to create. So when we come together, it's not to see the noise as something to manage or avoid. This is evidence that the body is alive. So who can I help today is a simple challenge that we can take away. Question to ask ourselves every morning when we come in here is, who can we help today? Not what am I going to get out of the meeting, or I hope the speaker is, one that I can understand. So we come to the end of this message, and it's the part where we actually take the bread and wine. Let it come with renewed understanding of what we're really doing. It's not just a performance. It's not a private ritual. It's a moment We remember not only Jesus' death, but how he lived. We remember the towel that was around his waist. We remember the words that he spoke to Peter. We remember his prayers for unity. We remember his invitation to serve and to love and to build each other up. And to remember that he did all of this on the very night that he was going to be betrayed and killed. If there was ever a night for Jesus to say, right, let's take some time out. I need to focus on myself. This was it. But he didn't take it. He didn't focus on himself. He focused on them and on us. So when we take the bread and wine today, it's not about thinking about our guilt. It's about looking outwards. Who needs me here today? Remembering that we still gather like this. It's not just commemorating a past event. It's continuing the mission of Christ in our own community. It's about carrying each other through the week, encouraging each other, noticing when someone's missing or someone's not doing so well. Being the kind of people who not only remembered Jesus, but resembled him. Philippians 2, let the mind of Christ, Philippians chapter 2, verse 3-5. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Not looking at your own interest only, but each of you on the interest of others. Let this mind be in you, which also was in Jesus Christ. And that's what we're remembering here this morning. So this is the mindset that transforms the memorial meeting from this solemn occasion to something completely different. So as we leave, we don't have our heads bowed in shame, but rather we have our hearts lifted with gratitude, our hands ready to serve, because the bread and this cup aren't symbols of what Christ did. They're just symbols of how he lived. They're invitations to become like him, to wash each other's feet, not literally, but spiritually, to carry each other's burdens, to speak life into tired hearts, to show up not to be fed, but to feed. And this is what it means. Do this in remembrance of me. So as we eat and drink, let's not do this as people weighed down by failure, but people lifted up by grace. We take the bread and wine not with fear, but with joy, and not in isolation, but in unity. Let's walk out of the room today with a new question on our lips. Not what did I get out of that, but who can I serve this week because of what Jesus did for me? So may God bless us with the strength, the humility, and the love to live that kind of remembrance until he comes. So with that, I think we can go straight into the bread and wine.